So this is taking things in a slightly different direction, looking at an exhibition history. In recent years, art museums have begun employing new narrative strategies and engaging with alternative discourses on art and history with the aim of giving visibility to individuals, peoples, and artistic practices that have traditionally been marginalised by Western-derived universal narratives. Symptomatic of this trend, Tate Liverpool's 2010 exhibition, Afromodern Journeys Through the Black Atlantic, attempted to offer a new reading of work by black artists by employing a novel model of curation inspired by Paul Gilroy's groundbreaking 1993 book, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness. The expansive exhibition displayed work by 66 artists, of whom over half were black. The inclusion of so many black artists in a single show was unprecedented at Tate at the time, and by making Gilroy's theorizations the basis for its curation, the exhibition represented a unique opportunity to depart from the separatism and evocations of difference that characterized many of the black survey shows of the 1980s, and illustrate the pivotal role played by black artists in the development of modern art. I was personally thrilled at the prospect of such an exhibition and overjoyed to see so many artworks that I admire up close for the first time. However, as I began reading the accompanying interpretive captions and wall text, I began to realize that claims made on behalf of the show had not been realized on its walls. Intrigued by this, I began conducting a close textual analysis of Afromodern to discover what it was really saying about the role of black artists in the development of modern art, and whether its modes of historicization and contextualization had in fact resulted in a new and challenging narrative in our perception of modernism and modernity. My focus in this research was not on the artworks, nor their physical arrangement and its phenomenological impact on audiences, but instead on the particular assertions made within the accompanying interpretive texts. Certainly, the experience of the visual has more impact on museum visitors than the experience of a text, not only because they don't necessarily read exhibition texts, but also because the visual experience is more open than one's response to a text. Visitors are also likely to make sense of exhibition texts in ways that diverge from those intended by the exhibition's curators. Nonetheless, these texts are created to instruct our engagement with exhibitions. Narratives and hierarchies are constructed in captions, wall texts, and catalogues to shape how we understand the artworks displayed. As such, they provide an insight into the attitudes and underlying intentions of the artwork of the individuals and institutions that produce them. In order to comprehend these attitudes and intentions, it's imperative that we examine what is expressed in exhibition texts, how it is expressed, and what impact that might have on how we come to comprehend the artworks on show. Sometimes exhibitions appear to present alternative narratives and perspectives, but closer inspection can reveal that established structures and relationships have merely been repackaged. As I'll show you today, this can occur in the subtle iteration and reiteration of the same statements about art and its histories, resulting in the reproduction and reinforcement of hegemonic narratives. Afromodern comprised 7 sections and encompassed Tate Liverpool's entire 4th floor. The 2 curators, Tanya Barson and Peter Gorschluter, included works dating from the early 20th century through to the early 2000s, and in order to engage with Gilroy's theorizations on cultural hybridity and transatlantic interconnections, works were selected from Europe, Africa, the Americas, and the Caribbean. In doing so, they hoped to reveal the interconnected and transnational nature of cultural practices that had assisted in the development of 20th century modernism, and most importantly, the vital contributions made by black artists to that development. On entering Afromodern, visitors encountered the exhibition's introductory wall text with this explanatory header: Afromodern explores the impact of different black cultures from around the Atlantic world on art from the early 20th century to today. A closer reading of this introductory sentence, however, discloses an underlying hegemonic perspective that pervaded the first half of the exhibition's other wall texts and captions. Allow me to explain. Given the Western European context for the exhibition, and that the word art was not accompanied by a definition, we may conclude that visitors were presumed to have a shared Western European understanding of art. On this basis, the precise construction of the sentence, the impact of, black cultures on art is significant. It implies that modernist art had already formed in Europe before it experienced the impact of black Atlantic cultures, which contradicted Gilroy's argument that black cultures were integral to the conception of modern cultural forms. Had the explanatory header for the exhibition been structured differently, for example, the involvement of black cultures in the development of art, it would have signified an entirely different relationship of influence between the continents surrounding the Atlantic. However, the wording and structure that was used suggested that modernism was a European project that was subsequently exported to, absorbed, and then influenced by non-European cultures. I'd like to now share with you how this hegemonic narrative of modernism was developed through the exhibition's remaining text. So transatlantic connections provided the thematic framework for Room 1, Black Atlantic Avant-Gardes. The largest of the 7 sections, it displayed artworks produced in the first 40 years of the 20th century by artists of the Harlem Renaissance, European modernists, and white Brazilian artists. The overall narrative across its accompanying texts was that while white European modernists developed a fascination with Africa and the black cultures of the United States, black Americans were developing a genre that combined modernist formal techniques to express a sense of black modernity and pride, and Brazilian modernists did likewise, but in relation to the nation's own cultural specificity. By placing these geographically disparate practices together, the exhibition illustrated transnational and intercultural connections, and also the contemporaneity of African American and white European artists working in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Thus challenging the notion that it was the latter that had initiated modernism. This effort was, however, negated by the wall text and captions accompanying the artworks. The introductory wall text for Room 1 stated that it examined the convergence of modernism and the Black Atlantic in early 20th century art, again reinforcing the idea that modernism had already formed in Europe in order for this subsequent convergence with black cultures of the Atlantic to occur. This similarly occurred in Room 3, titled Black Orpheus, Negritude, Creolization, Natural Synthesis. This section traced the impact of negritude in the visual arts of the Black Atlantic region and the forms of modernism that developed from it in work by artists such as Jacob Lawrence and Wilfredo Lamb. The introductory wall text for this third room explained that the Nigerian movement of natural synthesis fused European modernism with local African aesthetic influences. Wilfredo Lamb was similarly described as combining European modernism with references to African Caribbean culture. These assertions highlighted instances of cultural hybridity. However, they also reinforced the idea that these developments occurred after modernism had taken shape in Europe, and therefore that these artists had developed a separate and derivative form of modernism. A hierarchical relationship between Europe and the other regions of the Atlantic also took shape through Room 1's interpretations of work by Man Ray, Picasso, Brancusi, and Modigliani. The work of these white European artists was contextualized by the cultural phenomenon of negrophilia, a fascination among white populations with black culture and the cultural forms of Africa. In the presentation of this tranche of modernism, Europe's relationship with black cultures was, rightly in this case, described as consumptive. A European interest in black cultures rather than an active mutual engagement between Europe and the black creativity of other regions. Drawing attention to this moment in modernism underscored the narrative developing through the exhibition in that Europe was the principal focus for modernism, or locus for modernism rather, with black creativity taking a subordinate position. This hierarchy also emerged through the exhibition's emphasis on black Atlantic artists being influenced by or simply using European modernist styles. For example, it was suggested in Room 1 that Norman Lewis and Walker Evans were influenced by the German realist movement, forgive me if I say it wrong, Neue Sachlichkeit. Similarly, in Room 3, it was stated that Agustin Cardenas had been influenced by Brancusi and Henry Moore, while Wilfredo Lamb was described as being influenced by Picasso and the language of primitivist European modernism. The fusion of European modernism with other practices in the Black Atlantic, the absorption of black cultural forms into European modernism, and the influence of European modernist styles on black creativity in other regions all undoubtedly occurred, and even simultaneously, as part of the diverse and multifarious evolution of modernism. However, their repeated articulation in the exhibition's wall texts and captions, without any suggestion as to how black artists actively participated in the conception and development of modernism, reinforced a hegemonic narrative in which Europe dominates and all other contributions are subsequent and subordinate trajectories. That several captions also described Black Atlantic artists as developing separate and different forms of modernism to that produced in Europe exacerbated this problem. For example, in Room 1, it was stated that artists of the United States, the Caribbean, and South America responded to and challenged this European art, developing their own distinctive forms of modernism, or my emphasis. This questionable distinction was similarly made with regard to individual artists. For example, Aaron Douglas was described as a foundational figure of Black Atlantic modernism, as opposed to modernism per se. Although it provided a platform for black creativity, by articulating a separation between European forms of modernism and Black Atlantic forms of modernism, and by failing to suggest that black artists had contributed to the early formations of modernism per se, the first half of the exhibition cemented a standard narrative of modernism rather than challenging it. The second half of the exhibition addressed works from the 1960s to the 2000s. Gilroy's ideas were considerably less apparent in its curation, particularly because the conceptual frameworks of transnationalism and cultural hybridity had been discarded. Rooms 4 to 7 were not arranged in a strict chronology, but according to themes that have been addressed by black artists. Although ethnicity was not the primary organising principle for these sections, the change in curatorial approach steered Afromodern into the territory of the Black Survey Show, that is, a large survey exhibition selected according to racial criteria. When exhibitions are initially devised on this basis, the subsequent application of non-racial themes does little to offset the interpretation and contextualization of the artworks in them in terms of the ethnic and cultural background of the artists, resulting in their notional separation from art's better-known histories. To avoid this problem, it was imperative that the wall texts and captions in the second half of the exhibition elucidated how the artworks related to modernism, the show's broader non-racial theme. The introductory wall text for Room 4, titled Dissident Identities, Radicalism, Resistance and Marginality, claimed that hybrid and transnational practices declined in the Black Atlantic in the 1960s and 70s, giving way to a more political concern with racial segregation and oppression. By noting that some of the artists shown in this room had also developed a practice of challenging or critiquing modernism in their work, the wall text made a link with the overall theme of the exhibition. Significantly, however, only 2 of the 10 works in this room were accompanied by captions that attempted to elucidate this connection with modernism. In the caption for Romeo Bearden's Blue Shade, it was stated that the work referenced Matisse's Blue Nude, and that the work demonstrated his interest in the representation of the black female body in modern art and art history. However, no explanation as to how the work might thus challenge or critique modernist representations of black women was offered. Instead, the caption inanely compared Bearden's and Matisse's works by stating that Bearden's is, quote, surrounded by less exotic vegetation of seeds and fruit, end quote. I beg to differ as well. A similarly insufficient link with modernism was presented in the caption for Bearden's mixed media work, Sermons, The Walls of Jericho. Instead of clarifying how, by referencing the way African cultural forms inspired the conception of modernism, Bearden might have been challenging Eurocentric readings of its development, the caption simply stated that African sculpture and its use in modern art were among its references. In Room 5, titled Reconstructing the Middle Passage, Diaspora and Memory, works addressing the transatlantic journey of slaves from Africa to the Americas and Caribbean were presented, thus linking to Gilroy's focus on the slave ship as a means by which the Black Atlantic regions became linked. Although Gilroy proposes that the slave trade was pivotal in the development of modernity and subsequent syncretic and modernist cultural practices, this was not noted in the accompanying interpretive text. Instead, real and imagined histories and historical recovery provided the theme. It was stated, for example, that Ellen Gallagher's Bird in Hand presented an alternative cartography of the Middle Passage, and that Renee Cox's Queen Nanny of the Maroons constructs a new vision of the historic leader as a symbol of black female struggle and empowerment. The strategy of revising and recovering history from the point of view of the present was identified in Thelma Golden and Glenn Ligon's contribution to the exhibition's catalogue as a populist form of modernism specific to black cultural practice and part of a critical reappropriation of modernity. However, this was neither discussed nor alluded to in the captions in Room 5. Without reference to this critical relationship to modernism, Room 5 had little connection with the curatorial premise and overarching theme of the exhibition. As with Room 4, it was essentially curated in accordance with a theme that only, or at least primarily, black artists have addressed. A race-based approach was also employed in the curation of Room 6, exhibiting bodies, racism, rationalism, and pseudoscience. The introductory wall text continued the claim made in Room 4 that for a period of the 20th century, hybrid cultural formations in the Black Atlantic region had been replaced by a concern with addressing issues of racism, oppression, and stereotyping. It stated that the works displayed explored how the black body has been positioned and represented in colonial imagery, modernist art, and the mass media. And a particular concern amongst them was how pseudoscientific classifications had provided the basis for 19th century depictions of the black body. Tracy Rose and Carrie Mae Weems were among the artists shown in this room whose works addressed the racist practices and attitudes of the 18th and 19th centuries that had helped to foster a sense of modernity in Europe. As such, these artworks were indirectly engaged in a critique of modernism through their critique of its deeper origins in relation to the notion of modernity. However, this was not noted in the captions. From postmodernism to post-black, appropriation, black humour, and double negatives was the seventh concluding section of the exhibition, and the accompanying captions and wall texts highlighted two aspects about the works on display. The first was that many of the works by this younger generation of black artists continued the practice already shown in Room 6 of addressing real, imagined, and untold histories. However, as was the case in the previous rooms, the practice of revising, recovering, or reimagining history was not discussed in this room's captions and wall texts as a modernist practice. The second aspect highlighted was the artist's use of appropriation, repetition, sampling, and recycling. In the wall text, this was defined as a post-black practice. The term post-black was initially conceived by Thelma Golden and Glenn Ligon in order to describe a particular attitude demonstrated by younger generation black artists in the US who are interested in redefining notions of blackness but refuse to be labelled as black artists. However, Golden has specified that the term does not denote a particular artistic strategy or technique and was not developed in order to categorise younger black artists. Yet, this is precisely how the term was used in Afromodern. This misuse of the term within the exhibition would have been admissible had it been suggested in the wall texts that a focus on so-called post-black practices might foster a new and challenging understanding of modernism, or even how the works displayed related to contemporary trajectories of modernism at all. Without an attempt at such a discussion, Room 7, like the three rooms preceding it, seemed to be curated primarily on racial grounds. Having journeyed through Afromodern and all its numerous texts, we can now summarise that the exhibition comprised two rather distinct halves. In the first half, we saw a mix of black and white artists practising in the first half of the 20th century. Reflecting on this curatorial approach, its co-curator, Tanya Barson, explained to me, quote, "We have this narrative of modernism, and all the people in the middle of it, the core of it's Picasso and Matisse, etc., and you can plot that. And then on the margins, there are these other figures." Now, if you cut that up the middle, flip it over, you bring the marginal figures into the centre, and you make the central figures the marginal ones. From this, I suppose you could plot a different narrative, end quote. Indeed, Afromodern's emphasis on black creativity certainly did offer a broader, more diverse, and thereby different narrative of modernism than those traditionally presented by major art museums and galleries. Like the other story, or Rhapsodies in Black, it prioritised the contributions of black artists to the development of modernism, but by bringing the work of black and white artists together, it brought black creativity into a wider discourse. However, as my analysis of the first half of the exhibition has revealed, this didn't prevent the curators from positioning white European artists as the principal protagonists of modernism, nor from locating modernism's conception and development in Europe. Furthermore, the notion of cultural hybridity was not sufficiently employed to deconstruct Eurocentric readings of time and space in in the Atlantic region in order to reposition black and white artists as equal protagonists in modernism's history. Instead, we found a narrative in which black artists developed derivative and separate tranches of modernism. By including contemporary artists, the second half of Afromodern attempted to position their work in a modernist lineage, which provided an opportunity to extend the narrative of modernism into the present and in new and challenging ways. However, opportunities to relate contemporary black practices to modernism or acknowledge instances of black artists renegotiating the tenets of modernism were not taken in the accompanying interpretive materials, the effect of which was to render established narratives of modernism unchallenged. I suggest that there are two primary reasons why Afromodern didn't elucidate the pivotal role played by black artists in the conception, development, and critique of modernist cultural practices. One is that hegemonic narratives of arts histories can become deeply ingrained in the minds of those trained in the discipline of art history, to the extent that, perhaps at a subconscious level, it seems counterintuitive to challenge them. As Barson commented to me, quote, "As a curator, what I usually do is stick really close to art history. When I see myself getting a little too much on my soapbox, I have to shift myself back and think about the art history because it's what I know," end quote. The other reason, which I discovered during my interview with Afromodern's other co-curator, Peter Gorschluter, is that the aim of challenging conventional narratives of modernism was not an objective or even a consideration when the exhibition was first conceived. Rather, the initial idea was to devise an exhibition of work by contemporary black artists of the generation represented in Afromodern's final post-black room. However, such an exhibition would have been at risk of being lateral and ahistorical. So it was decided that the show would also explore the possible predecessors of contemporary black artistic practices, which eventually led to a decision to also consider or reconsider modernism within the show. It's probable, therefore, that the idea of employing Gilroy's concept of the Black Atlantic in the intellectual framework of the exhibition only arose at a much later point. While it's perfectly acceptable that curators arrive at their ideas for exhibitions in this way, the statements and narratives presented in the interpretive texts indicate that offering a novel and moreover challenging perspective on modernism never really made it into the exhibition's curation.